Anger as an emotion, well, without it, would we even be here, literally, societally, or beating our enemies? But it's been anathemized in the modern world, and this makes sense. What does rage do, if not kill a lot of people? Samuel Parker, who's a British journalist, got in touch with his rage and gets in touch with all of ours in the new book, Good Anger, How Rethinking Rage Can Change Our Lives. Hi, Sam. Welcome to The Gist.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So I take your premise, which is that of all the emotions, and we're told to get in touch with our emotions, there is one that we're told put off to the side. That's the scary one. And it's anger. And you're saying it shouldn't be. Was this mostly through personal experience?
It was. I watched the mental health revolution that took place over the last 5 years in the UK, in terms of awareness, if not treatment, take place with great interest because we were talking about depression and anxiety and removing the stigma from those, which was a great development. But we weren't talking about anger, either on its own or the role it plays in depression and anxiety. And yet at the same time in my life, the thing that really enabled me to finally break free of being a very anxious person was getting in touch with anger. So there was this strange disconnect between the public mental health conversation and my own experience. And that was sort of the beginning of the book. I thought, well, maybe I can find a way to put these two pieces together.
How did your anxiety manifest?
I had what's called generalized anxiety disorder. So every day for me, since I was a child, really, was this sort of thrum of dread. I felt this unease at all times. And I started off in my young life medicating that with alcohol. As I grew and matured, realized that I needed to try and find other ways to manage it. And because I thought that the opposite of anxiety was relaxation, I tried everything that I could in the wellness space. So I tried to meditate and gratitude journaling and deep plunge, cold plunging and all that stuff. Nothing wrong with any of it, but for me, it didn't work.
Well, if you journal at the same time as the cold plunge, the pages could get wet.
Yeah, exactly. That was where I went wrong. Yeah. When I started to get in touch with anger, it was almost like it was on the opposite side of a set of scales from my anxiety. And what I learned through a combination of therapy and my own research was that often we have racket emotions for anger. And for lots of people, it's sadness. They might cry when they get angry. For me, it was anxiety. So actually, I was holding on to a lot of anger whilst believing myself to be a person who wasn't angry. And that was manifesting as anxiety. So that was where I was going wrong.
Yeah, tell me about racket emotions.
So racket emotion is when we learn, usually in childhood, that a certain emotion is not acceptable or is dangerous for us to express. And so we develop a system of displaying another emotion in its place. So the classic one is the clown who's crying on the inside, right? So someone who's sad and tries to make everyone laugh all the time when they feel their sadness as a way of pushing it out of the room. With anger, it's actually a classically female racket emotion to cry when you get angry. I interviewed lots of women who say they do this in the workplace, and that causes them all kinds of frustrations and troubles. My racket emotion for anger was anxiety. And so, when we have the conversation about the third of the people, globally, 33% of people have an anxiety disorder. Many people suffer with depression. Unexpressed anger and inability to express anger is a major component of that for many, many people, but it's not really part of the public understanding of these conditions yet.
Right. And there's a lot in the book about the gendered aspect of anger, but it does strike me that there has been this chronicled, documented rise in anxiety, and it gets blamed on a lot of things. And I think some of them must be valid, the inundation of stimulus just with all these interconnected phones and computers in our pockets, and all the troubles of the world are now pressed down upon us. But it also, from reading your book and talking to you, does strike me that around the same time that anxiety went up, anger began to be seen as illegitimate, something to tamp down. And so, the book does get to the idea of good anger, but there is a racket emotion, a seesaw, a push and pull of these things. And would you say that an underexplored reason why generations, younger generations, or just society as a whole are showing up as so anxious is that the anti-anger messaging has worked?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, I think a really important distinction to make at the top of a conversation about anger is that it's distinct from aggression and violence, right? And they often get conflated.
Well, ideally it is. And that's the problem, that it's not always, or one triggers the other.
True, but anger is an emotion, aggression and violence is a behavioral choice. And it's important to separate them. And so, when anger gets demonized, often what people are really demonizing, or what they're considering, a taboo is aggressive and violent behavior. And that's very important. But for most people, their anger issue isn't actually anger out, isn't actually being overwhelmed and becoming aggressive and confrontational. Far more people in the world keep it in, and they suppress it and they repress it and they deny it. And I do think that's a major component in why young people are feeling anxious. In the mental health conversation, it's become, it's okay not to be okay, right? That's a phrase we hear a lot in the UK in the mental health conversation. And really what that means is it's okay to be depressed and it's okay to be anxious. This is a massive bit of progress from even my parents' generation.
Yeah.
But we haven't had that same sort of up-to-date conversation about anger as we have the other emotions and the part that anger plays in depression and anxiety.
Yeah, and in the United States, we have similar conversations, but we kind of reject the UK's health funding and their conception of this. So we have the expression, it's okay not to be UK. Damn it, I screwed up the joke.
I got it.
So we have the expression, it's okay not to be UK.
Yes.
Now you laugh. As if I said it correct. Okay, wait a minute. Aggression and violence is a choice. We'd like for it to be, but with so many other actions that stem from emotions, the message, and I think the expertise, is trying to tell us not that we are beholden to our emotions, but that it's a natural outgrowth. And the thing that we're thinking of, like you just talked about self-medicating, right? I think the cutting edge of understanding either addiction or just use and dependency is we shouldn't say that reaching for the bottle or pills or whatever self-medication is a choice, right? It's more advanced and exalted to think of it as a natural outgrowth for what we're experiencing. Yet with anger, you said, that it is a choice, that violence is a choice. I mean, it does seem more intertwined than simply saying, oh, anger's fine, but once you've decided or once you find yourself swinging a fist, well, that's activating an entirely different part of the brain. It seems very intertwined to me.
Here's another way to think of it, I think. Aggression and violence are a rejection of anger. It's saying that you can't tolerate what the anger is pointing you towards, which is that it's been made to feel vulnerable, that you've been made to feel afraid. It's pointing you towards an unmet need that you have, a wound that you haven't healed. So when we get aggressive and violence, really we're pushing anger out of the way and we're just reacting. So they are related, but they are distinct. And I think actually having a more open conversation about anger and what it's for as a society is only going to take us to a place where less people react in that way. But already I would say, most people, when they get angry, they don't swing a fist, right? You're only really going to do that if you're absolutely backed into a corner. And maybe in a tiny percentage of scenarios, it is appropriate to swing a fist because you're under physical attack or something like that. It's a very, very unusual behavior for most people. And that's why I would say it was a choice, because when you look at 95% or more of examples of people getting angry, it's not a choice that they make.
Yeah, right. That's true. It definitely was 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago. And that's for a few reasons, but it's also because in those societies, the fruits of your rage and anger and violence might benefit you more than they do in our society. The downside is so much greater. So that's good societally, but I don't know if it changes the wiring of emotions.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. But, anger has been demonized from the very beginning. I mean, people, the Stoics, Seneca wrote an entire book on why anger is a monster that we need to overcome and that should be banished from the human experience. So people have been trying to repress anger and get it out of the way for a very long time. It was one of the 7 deadly sins. This idea of it being sinful and inherently dangerous is very baked into our culture. And, you know, but at the same time, once upon a time, sadness was also on that list, right? And look at how far we've come with discussing that and thinking about it.
Yeah. And it was one of the 8 evil thoughts, right?
The 8 evil thoughts, yeah.
What were the other evil thoughts?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but most of them came to be on the 7 deadly sins. So it was gluttony and sloth and, you know.
I wonder which one didn't make the cut. That would be a great discussion.
It was sadness that fell off.
Sadness fell off?
Yes. Huh. Yeah. It took a few hundred years, but it fell away.
Why? Why was sadness one seen as... So, okay, the way these lists get constituted, I mean, no, we don't know who puts stylus, puts quill to papyrus. But they're expressing something about society and what is societally useful and what is not. So why was there a time when sadness, maybe it had something to do with the horrors of the world, but why was there a time when sadness was absolutely something that was looked at only pejoratively, and then it got a bit rehabilitated?
So it was linked to inertia. And actually these lists, so Evagrius Ponticus, who was the hermit monk who in AD 375 wrote down the 8 evil thoughts, he was actually writing for other monks. So he wasn't actually writing for the general population. It was only as history developed and Christianity really took hold that this list became, it was the first attempt at a sort of codified moral ethics for Christianity. In time, the 10 Commandments overtook that. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, the 7 deadly sins were the sort of checklist, the moral checklist. Right. And eventually that went from monks and then the most learned people in society through the Middle Ages, and then it started to be to percolate through general society, and it became something that you would hear in the pulpit when preachers started speaking in sort of local languages rather than Latin all the time. So that was kind of the trajectory of it. Somewhere along the way, I think it was Gregory the Great who shrunk the list down from 8 to 7, and so sadness fell off. But, you can look at the other 7 deadly sins, the other 6 sins, and see the way that they have been at least partially rehabilitated, right? We don't really think of lust as sinful as long as everybody is, as long as everybody is signed up for it and consented, do what you want with lust, Envy is kind of
without it, we wouldn't be here, right?
Right, exactly, right? Envy is kind of the engine room of social media in a lot of ways, So we've come to an accommodation with all of the 7 deadly sins, apart from really anger, I would say.
Envy is the only deadly sin that is not pleasurable, they say.
Yeah, that's interesting. Certainly true.
I do think, it's hard to... emotions are fundamental to the human condition. So it's hard to separate ourselves from our milieu, our time, our technology, our society. It very much seems to me that anger was more useful when we went to war more and when we had to go to war and when xenophobia was even more warranted. So now that it's not, and now that what I'm getting at is there's a real economic angle to this. Now that placidity and a lack of violence and aggression are the things that can get the individual the most resources, anger to some extent became a vestigial organ, but unlike the appendix, there is still a use for it, you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, look, anger is always alerting you to a change you need to make in your life, right? Something is not right. A boundary has been violated. There is an unmet need. Somebody at work is attacking you. Your partner isn't understanding you. Like when you get angry, it's because there's useful information in it always. And not only that, right, but there's a great degree of energy. It's the most energizing emotion that we have. Now, when I come back to that thing of violence being a choice, if you reframe anger to yourself as a source of energy with which you can go and do whatever you want with it, then it can start to become really useful. I'll give you an example. If you're in a work context and a colleague makes you angry because they've disrespected you, and it's normally always a feeling of like, this person doesn't respect my position or whatever in an office, and you get angry about that. Now, you can go on Slack and you can slag that person off. Sorry, that was a Britishism. You can criticize that person in private with a peer and lose half a morning of productivity to that. Or you can take that energy and you can turn it into a fuck you energy. Sorry for swearing. And, go after a piece of work or a project or a report or something that's going to outshine them. You know, you can funnel that energy into doing something that's going to get you ahead. So I don't believe that it's this sort of like outdated, barbaric emotion. I actually think it's a very useful, quite sophisticated emotion. It's very linguistic. It's very social. And when we listen to it, when we learn to listen to it calmly and use the information that it tells us about ourselves, not just the other person, and use the energy that it gives us to go and do something useful, then suddenly anger is a good emotion, not a bad one. And that's kind of what the book is about. It's about how can we update our perspective on it.
Yeah. It's a memoir and it's history, but it's a social critique. So turning the pendulum of defining anger as mostly this bad emotion, was that mostly well-intentioned, or do you put your finger on some aspects of that where we went too far for reasons that weren't necessarily just out of trying to help people?
Sorry, I lost the thread of the question.
Okay, so the book's a lot of things, and one of them is a societal critique. So I think when I read it and when I'm listening to you, it seems that the critique is bound up with another kind of critique where, I don't want to overstate it, but the cartoon version of this is something like the feminization of society. There were probably impulses to treat anger as only bad, as something to be suppressed,
right,
for reasons that fit or for reasons that played into an agenda of the people doing that defining, don't you think?
Yes, I agree. And I think, again, going back to the workplace, something that HR departments, when they came in the general trajectory of workplace culture, I would argue, of the last 50 years or so, part of that trajectory has been trying to remove workplace bullying. This was a problem for people for a long time. Obnoxious people at work, aggressive people at work, they would always get ahead. Now, that's still obviously the case at a lot of places. I'm not saying that's being solved or anything like that. But there have been big efforts made to change that culture. When you look at why people, if you look into the quiet quitting phenomenon, which has come up in recent years, and drill into the data around why people say they're quiet quitting now, it's not actually about remuneration or them feeling that their company doesn't, care about them or anything like that. The majority of it is feeling under-challenged. They don't feel like they're being developed. Now, I would trace this back to the fact that we've lost the ability to have difficult conversations at work, challenging conversations, direct feedback. Bosses are afraid to do it in case they're a bad boss or they get into trouble. Peers to peers don't want to do it, and so on. Again, this isn't true in every industry or every workplace, but in every workplace I've worked at, this has been an issue. So I do think in some cases there's been an overcorrection, and part of the conversation we need to have about anger now and neutralizing it as a topic and becoming better at admitting to it and talking about it and all the rest of it is to address some of these overcorrections that we've made.
Yeah, the full-scale rejection of anger dovetails with the idea of safetyism that Jonathan Haidt and others have written about. Yeah. And so then there's the phrase and your conception of good anger, which is clever, I think. And you know this, you're a writer. It's one of those phrases that stands out like, cold fire, just because when phrases are contradictions, they strike us as, oh, that's weird. What do you mean by that? So you know this, right? It has that appeal. But tell me what you mean by this, and maybe if you think that this phrase, if people understand it and took it forward, how it would work.
So I'd summarize it by saying good anger is something that people generally find very difficult to do, which is when we experience the feeling without fear or shame, listen to it calmly, act on it wisely in a way that makes our lives better, not worse.
So to interrupt, is this different from the Stoics, who you said you criticized a little bit for writing this whole book against anger?
So, yes. I mean, Seneca wasn't quite saying that. Actually, the closest approximation was before that, Aristotle. Aristotle said, anybody can become angry. That's easy. To be angry with the right person, the right degree, at the right time for the right purpose in the right way, that's not easy. So really, if you want a definition of good anger, you can go right back to Aristotle, who was much more balanced on the topic of whether anger is good or bad than certainly Seneca was. I can't speak to the rest of the Stoics. It's about learning to use the information and the energy of anger in a way that makes your life better, not worse. It's finding the through line between anger out and anger in. Anger out is a problem that we've been used to talking about as a culture for a very long time. There are many courses and books and things for people with anger out issues. Anger in, I think, is a much bigger problem that we don't talk about because it tends to be a problem for the individual rather than society. But many people are suffering because they don't have the ability to express anger. They're people pleasers, they're conflict avoiders, they keep the peace at the expense of their own. And so helping people find the through line between those two extremes, I think, is where we need to be.
Give me a tangible example of how your life has changed since you started adopting this framework.
Well, paradoxically, I feel a lot more peaceful. I feel a lot more generosity of spirit towards other people. I feel less judgmental of others. I'm a big believer in the concept of the shadow, that if we sort of deny a part of ourselves, we project it onto others. I think this is a massive problem in society. And so since I've started being comfortable with my own anger and talking about it and expressing it, I have less negative interpretations of other people. So it's made my life better in that sense. I already mentioned the alleviation of anxiety. That's been a life-changing thing for me.
But it really did? It did. This is a sort of a cognitive behavioral therapy, or you had a concept, you philosophized your way out of anxiety?
No, I talked about anger. I engaged with the things from my past and present that I was angry about, that I wasn't admitting and I wasn't aware of. And I got used to expressing it. And then eventually when I got used to expressing it and feeling it and identifying it in myself, I got used to acting on it in a way that was proportional and helpful. Now, I still get it wrong lots of the time. It's difficult to do. But the more I've gone down that path, the less anxious and the happier I felt.
So I know you write about wellness in general, and I think that you also are pretty good at discerning what is bona fide and what is maybe in the realm of the guru. I don't know if you have another emotion that's in you or the next book, but what's a big, let's call it wellness trend that you think, if not is doing more harm than good, has a lot of problems associated with it?
I would say maybe therapy speak.
Mm-hmm. Speak, right. Okay.
Yeah. And therapeutic language, which has sort of, entered the sort of public discourse. And something I've observed is that particularly young people will go down a little bit of the path towards therapy or figuring out what's wrong with them, let's say emotionally. And they learn the language and the sort of performance of that, and they kind of stop there. They get the diagnosis and they think, okay, job done. Now I can go and talk about it with the world and so on. Actually, anyone who's been in long-time therapy knows that repetition and coming back to the same issues time and time again, so that it truly kind of leads to changes with how you see yourself in the world, takes a very, very long time. So there's a short-termism and there's a therapy language issue that has now sort of become part of the wellness space that I think isn't really helpful.
Yeah. I see that too. There are a couple aspects of it. One is everything is traumatic, and so that's an exaggeration, and we begin to, you have to be resilient, and if your very words are indicating that things are so terrible, you're not going to be resilient. The other thing is very much fits in with what you're talking about, anger. It tends to sand the rough edges that can actually be useful.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a guy I talk about in the book called John Wellwood, who was a therapist who was really interested in how what was then a new influx of mysticism from the East, meditation and yoga and so on, could work alongside Western psychotherapy as a package. And he coined the term spiritual bypassing, which is basically he saw a bunch of hippies trying to, shortcut their way to nirvana with meditation, but they hadn't actually done any kind of like hard work on themselves and their issues. And so he kind of despaired of this. I think now we're in a period of wellness bypassing where lots of people jump straight to the online performance of, you know, the meditation or the sort of therapy language, or, you know, I mean, how many times have I got to watch a podcast and see a millionaire tell another millionaire that cold plunges is the way to good mental health, you know?
When we know it's journaling. Yeah.
When we know it's journaling, exactly. So, yeah, I do think...
And what is a podcast if not a journaling of the air? Yes.
Well, good point. But yeah, I think, you know, I spoke to a misinformation expert for the book that didn't actually make it into the book in the end. But, you know, he was talking about how the wellness space and the online health space is by far and away the area of the biggest area of misinformation that he sees on TikTok and so on. And it's a problem that seems to have no solution, really. It's quite terrifying.
If it makes you mad, that's fine. Honor that emotion, Sam.
Exactly.
Sam Parker is the author of Good Anger, How Rethinking Rage Can Change Our Lives. Fiery conversation. I know we almost came to blows, but I think we're better off for it.
I agree.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.